Elizabeth Carter did not cry when her uncle signed her life away. She stood straight, chin up, hands folded, and let them believe she was defeated. They called Nathaniel Hayes a broken man, dangerous, cold beyond saving. Her family sent her to him like a punishment wrapped in white linen. But as the carriage pulled away from everything she had ever known, Elizabeth made herself one quiet iron promise: she would not disappear. If you believe a woman's worth is never truly gone. Subscribe. Stay until the end and tell me what city you're watching from. The morning Elizabeth Carter was married off the sky over Charlottesville was the kind of pale, washed-out blue that offered no comfort. No clouds to soften the light. No breeze to cool the heat already building across the Virginia hills. Summer had come early that year, and it sat over the county like a judgment heavy, unmoving, merciless. She stood in the doorway of the courthouse with her hands clasped in front of her and her back straight as a fence post. The dress was white muslin plain at the collar, sewn by her own hands over 3 sleepless nights. There were no flowers pinned at the waist, no ribbon at the cuff, nothing that said celebration, nothing that said joy. The people gathered outside did not bother to whisper. "That's her," a woman said loud enough for the whole street to hear. "The Carter girl." "Shameful," said another. "What her mother must think, God rest her soul. I heard she was meeting that Whitmore fellow in secret. A married man, mind you. I heard she threw herself at him." Elizabeth heard every word. She had been hearing versions of those words for 3 months, since the night Daniel Whitmore's carriage overturned on the road outside town, and she had been the one to stop and help him. She had sent for the doctor. She had sat with him in the dirt until help arrived. She had done what any decent person would do. And the county had decided that decent women did not sit in the dirt beside married men after dark. The truth had not mattered. The truth almost never did not when the story people preferred was more interesting. Inside the courthouse, her uncle William Carter was already speaking with the magistrate. He had not asked Elizabeth how she felt about any of it. He had not asked her much of anything since the rumors began. What he had done was calculate the scandal attached to her name was costing him business, costing him standing, costing him the goodwill he had spent 20 years building in Albemarle County. And he had found a solution. Nathaniel Hayes has agreed to the arrangement. William had told her 10 days prior, not looking up from his desk. "You'll leave within the fortnight." "I don't know him," Elizabeth had said. "No one knows him particularly well. That's rather the point. The point," she had repeated very carefully, "is to remove me from sight." William had finally looked up. His expression was not cruel exactly. It was something worse than cruelty. It was efficiency. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has resolved. "You've left me very few options, Elizabeth." She had wanted to say, "I left you no options because I did nothing wrong." She had wanted to say, "You are punishing me for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you know it." She had wanted to say a great many things. Instead, she had folded her hands in her lap and said, "Tell me about Hayes Plantation." Now standing at the courthouse door with the county watching and judging and whispering, she reminded herself of that moment. The choice she had made to ask a question instead of weep. She had decided that night in William's office that if she was going to be handed off like property, she would at least arrive at her destination clear-eyed and prepared. Nathaniel Hayes, 35 years old, owner of the largest private landholding in Middle Tennessee, nearly 4,000 acres of river-bottom farmland outside Nashville, worked by hired hands and a small staff of household servants. Wealthy by any measure. Powerful by the standards of a young country still figuring out what power meant. And feared. That was the word that appeared in every account she had gathered, every careful question she had asked of people who knew the region. Feared. He had served in the War of 1812, risen to the rank of major, and come home 3 years ago, a different man than the one who had left. People said he did not smile. People said he did not entertain. People said the workers on his land obeyed him without question, and that he had dismissed his last 3 housekeepers without explanation. The broken soldier, They called him in the way people name things they don't understand quickly, with a label that lets them stop thinking. Elizabeth had spent 3 months being labeled. She understood with a cold and particular clarity what it meant to have a name replace your personhood. The magistrate appeared in the doorway and nodded at her. It was time. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Nathaniel Hayes arrived without ceremony of his own. No family, no attendants, no one to stand beside him. He wore a dark coat and a plain cravat, and he did not look at her when she entered the room. He looked at the magistrate. He looked at the window. He looked at the floor. Elizabeth looked at him. He was taller than she had expected, broader through the shoulder. There was a scar that ran along the left side of his jaw, faded to silver, and his hair was dark with threads of early gray at the temples despite his age. His hands, she noticed, were large and work-roughened, not the hands of a man who spent his days behind a desk despite his wealth. He did not look broken to her. He looked careful, as if he had learned to take up as little space as possible despite his size. As if he had spent years practicing the art of being present without being noticed. Interesting, she thought, which was not the thought she had expected to have standing at her own coerced marriage. When the magistrate asked if she consented to the union, Elizabeth said, "I do," in a clear, even voice that carried to every corner of the room. When the magistrate asked Nathaniel the same question, there was a pause, barely a breath long, but she caught it, and then he said, "I do," in a voice that sounded like a man completing a necessary transaction. There was no kiss. The magistrate did not suggest one, and neither of them reached for it. Nathaniel Hayes picked up his hat from the table beside him, set it on his head, and said without looking directly at her, "The carriage is waiting, Mrs. Hayes." It was the first time anyone had called her that. She picked up her traveling bag, one bag, because William had made clear that she was not to take much, and followed her husband out into the summer heat. The ride to Tennessee took 4 days. They traveled with a driver and a single outrider. 2 men who clearly worked for Nathaniel and who clearly understood that conversation with their employer was not encouraged. Nathaniel rode inside the carriage with her for the first day and a half, and in that time he said perhaps 20 words. Elizabeth did not fill the silence with chatter. She had never been a woman who spoke to ease her own discomfort. She watched the Virginia countryside give way to the mountains, and she thought and she planned, and occasionally she read from the small book she had tucked into her bag, a volume on agricultural soil management that had belonged to her father. On the second afternoon, Nathaniel looked at the book. "That's an unusual choice for travel reading," he said. "I find it practical," she said without looking up. Another silence. "Your father farm?" he asked. "He did. 120 acres outside Gordonsville. He lost most of it the year before he died." She turned a page. "Poor decisions and a bad harvest. A common enough story. And you learned the land from him." "He taught me what he knew. He believed—" She paused, considering how much to say. That knowledge didn't belong only to men, whatever the fashion of the time suggested. Nathaniel said nothing to that, but he did not look away from the book. That evening when they stopped at a tavern for the night, he told the innkeeper they required 2 rooms. Elizabeth noted it. She had not been certain what to expect, and she noted it without expression and without comment, because she had resolved not to make assumptions about this man based on the stories other people had told about him. She would watch. She would learn. And she would draw her own conclusions. Hayes Plantation sat at the end of a long oak-lined drive, and when Elizabeth first saw it in the late afternoon of their 4th day of travel, she felt something she had not expected, a kind of stillness. Not peace exactly, not comfort, but the particular stillness that comes when a landscape is honest, when it doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. The main house was large and well-built white-painted timber, with a deep front porch set back from the Cumberland River, in a stand of old hardwoods. The outbuildings were solid, the fencing in good repair, the kitchen garden visible at the side of the house, and clearly tended though by whom she couldn't yet tell. It was not the grand estate she had half imagined, half feared. It was a working place. A serious place. She could work with serious. A woman came out onto the porch as the carriage stopped, middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with a ring of keys at her hip and an expression of measured caution on her face. "Mrs. Pruitt," Nathaniel said, as he helped Elizabeth down from the carriage with a hand that was there, and gone in an instant the barest courtesy. "This is Mrs. Hayes." Mrs. Pruitt looked at Elizabeth the way people look at something unexpected, not unkind, but assessing. "Ma'am," she said. "Mrs. Pruitt." Elizabeth met her eyes directly. "I'm glad to meet you. I hope you'll be patient with me while I learn how things are done here. I'm sure you know this house far better than I do." Something shifted in the housekeeper's expression. Not warmth yet, but a loosening of wariness. "I'll show you to your room, ma'am." Nathaniel had already turned away toward the stables. No introduction to the rest of the house. No tour. No welcome. Elizabeth picked up her traveling bag and followed Mrs. Pruitt inside. Her room was at the end of the east corridor, separated from the master bedroom by a sitting room and 2 closed doors. She unpacked her single bag with deliberate care, hanging her dresses, setting her books on the small table by the window, placing her mother's silver hairbrush on the vanity. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. 24 years old, married to a stranger. 4 days' travel from the only home she had ever known, in a state she had never visited, in a house that did not yet know her name. "Well," she said aloud to her reflection quietly, because she had always found it useful to say hard things out loud. "Here you are?" She pinned her hair, straightened her collar, and went downstairs to introduce herself to the cook. Dinner that first night was served in the formal dining room, a long table that sat 12 and was set for 2 at opposite ends. Elizabeth looked at the arrangement and made a decision. She picked up her plate, her glass, and her silverware, carried them to the chair immediately to the right of Nathaniel's, and sat down. He looked at her. She unfolded her napkin. "It seems wasteful to shout across a table," she said. "I hope you don't mind." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at his food. "No," he said. "I don't mind." They ate in silence. But it was a different silence than the carriage, smaller somehow, and less cold. In the days that followed, Elizabeth learned the rhythms of Hayes Plantation, the way she had learned everything in her life that mattered methodically without fanfare by paying attention. She learned that Mrs. Pruitt ran the house with efficiency and a slight edge of anxiety. An anxiety Elizabeth eventually realized that was not the woman's natural character, but a response to years of not knowing what would set the master off. She learned that the cook, a sturdy woman named Agnes, had been with the household since before the war, and regarded Nathaniel with the specific fondness of someone who has watched a person suffer and cannot say so. She learned that the field foreman, a man named Tom Hicks, ran the agricultural operations with competence and a quiet resentment of being excluded from the account books. She learned, too, that Nathaniel Hayes rose before sunrise every morning and did not return to the house until mid-morning, that he ate dinner at the same time each evening, that he did not drink beyond a single glass of wine with his meal, that he read in the evening serious books, histories and surveying texts and journals of natural philosophy, and retired early. She learned all of this by watching. She did not yet know what to do with it. 10. On the 5th day, she went to the estate office. The door was open. Nathaniel sat behind a large desk covered in ledgers and correspondence, his coat off his sleeves rolled to the elbows. He did not look up when she appeared in the doorway. "Is this a good time?" she asked. "I'm working." "I know. I won't be long." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, because she had decided that waiting for an invitation in her own household was a habit she could not afford to develop. "I've been reviewing the household accounts." He looked up then. "The household accounts are Mrs. Pruitt's domain. Mrs. Pruitt keeps excellent records of expenditure. She doesn't appear to keep records of what's produced on the property, the kitchen garden, the smokehouse, the dairy, which means there's no way to calculate waste or savings against what's purchased in town." She set a sheet of paper on the corner of his desk. "I've started a supplemental ledger. I thought you should know." Nathaniel looked at the paper. His expression was unreadable. "You've been here 5 days," he said. "Yes. And you've audited the household accounts." "I reviewed them. I haven't changed anything." She folded her hands in front of her, a gesture she had learned from her father, who had always said that a person's hands gave away what their face could hide. She kept hers still. "If you'd prefer I didn't, I won't. But there's inefficiency here that's costing you money, and I don't see the virtue in ignoring it." A silence. The kind she was beginning to recognize, not hostile, but weighing. "Where did you learn bookkeeping?" he asked. "From my father, and from necessity." She let that sit for a moment. "I understand you didn't marry me because you wanted a partner in managing the estate. I'm not presuming that's what I am, but I'm here, and I'm not idle by nature, and I would rather be useful than decorative." He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked back at his desk. "Leave the ledger," he said. "I'll review it." She left it. She left the room. And in the corridor out of sight, she allowed herself one small exhale of relief. What Elizabeth did not expect, what she had not permitted herself to expect, because expectation was a kind of hope, and hope in her current situation seemed a dangerous luxury, was to find evidence that Nathaniel Hayes was a different man in private than the one the county described. She found the first piece of evidence on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks after her arrival. She was in the kitchen garden when Agnes came out of the house with a basket and a look of cheerful purpose. "Where are you going?" Elizabeth asked. "The Harmon place, ma'am." Agnes nodded toward the far edge of the property. "Jonas Harmon's wife took sick fever. Mr. Hayes sent me with supplies." Elizabeth put down her trowel. "Mr. Hayes sent you?" "Yes, ma'am. He does it regular when folks on the neighboring properties are in trouble. Sends food or medicine money, or just checks that someone's looking after them." Agnes seemed to realize she'd said more than she intended, and her expression shifted toward caution. "He doesn't like it talked about." "I see," Elizabeth said. She picked up her trowel and went back to work, and she turned that information over in her mind, the way she turned soil, carefully looking at what was underneath. She found the second piece of evidence a week later. She was returning from a walk along the river when she came across Nathaniel at the fence line of the home pasture in conversation with a young field hand whose arm was in a rough sling. Nathaniel was talking to the man in a low, direct voice, not the voice he used with her, which was sparse and careful, but something slightly different, something that had patience in it. She stopped at enough of a distance to not intrude, and she watched. The young man showed Nathaniel something about the fence, a break in the lower rail, and Nathaniel crouched down to look at it, and then he did something Elizabeth had not seen him do before. He smiled. It was a small thing, quick and gone. But it changed his whole face. She turned and walked back toward the house before he could look up and find her watching. She found the third piece of evidence in a different way, not by observation, but by conversation on a September evening, when the heat had finally begun to release its grip, and they were sitting on the front porch after dinner, as they had taken to doing in the particular comfortable silence that had gradually replaced the uncomfortable one. "Tom Hicks says you've been speaking with him about the Southfield rotation," Nathaniel said. Elizabeth turned her head slightly. "I hope that wasn't inappropriate." "Tom Hicks hasn't spoken that many words voluntarily in 3 years." There was something in his voice, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "He told me you suggested a cover crop. Winter rye. The soil in that section is depleted. You can see it in the color and the drainage patterns. A cover crop would restore it over the winter and reduce erosion from the spring floods." She looked back at the dark line of the tree. "Your father didn't rotate, from what I can tell from the old records." "No. He believed in working land until it was finished. And then buying more." She considered that. "That's one philosophy. It's not mine." He said it simply, without apology, but also without the careful removal of emotion she had come to expect from him. "I've been trying to undo his practices since I took over the property. I don't always know what I'm doing." Elizabeth looked at him, then directly, which she did rarely, because she had noticed that direct looks made him retreat. "You're doing better than the account books suggest you believe," she said. He met her eyes for a moment. Then he looked back at the tree line. "You've been reading my account books." "Only the ones you left on your desk while I was reviewing the household ledger." I couldn't help noticing. "You could have helped noticing." "I could have," she agreed. "But then I wouldn't have known, and I wouldn't have been able to tell you." Another silence, longer than usual. The cicadas sang in the dark beyond the porch. "The South Field," he said finally. "What kind of ride did you have in mind?" She told him. October arrived, and with it a letter from Virginia. Elizabeth was in the sitting room when Mrs. Pruitt brought it, a thick letter in an envelope she recognized as her Uncle William's hand. She turned it over, once set it on the table beside her, and finished the paragraph she was reading before she opened it. The letter was 3 pages long. It informed her in William's careful, impersonal prose that the county continued to discuss her situation with disapprobation, that her departure had not entirely resolved the damage to the family's reputation, and that he hoped she was conducting herself with appropriate discretion so as not to cause further embarrassment. He asked after Nathaniel Hayes in a way that made clear he was actually asking about the state of the property and its finances. He did not ask how she was. He did not inquire about her health, her comfort, or her state of mind. He asked her to write to him with any relevant information about the Hayes estate because he was considering a business proposition and wanted to know more about the man's financial position. Elizabeth folded the letter. She held it for a moment. Then she carried it to the fireplace. There was a small fire, just enough to take the evening chill off the room, and she put it in the flames and she watched it burn. Bad news. She turned. Nathaniel was in the doorway, still in his working clothes, holding his hat. He had a habit of standing in doorways for a moment. Before entering rooms, she had noticed it early, and spent some time thinking about what it meant. A man who always checked his escape route. A man who was not sure of his welcome in spaces that should have been his own. "A letter from my uncle," she said. Nothing that required a response. He looked at the fireplace. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was the first time he had asked her that. The first time in nearly 3 months of marriage that he had asked her anything that touched on her inner state. She thought about the letter. She thought about William Carter's handwriting, neat and bloodless as a ledger entry. She thought about being 14 years old and watching her father's land go piece by piece to men who knew how to exploit a grieving family's desperation. "I'm well," she said, which was true enough. "Thank you for asking." He nodded. He came into the room and sat in the chair across from hers, and he opened the book he'd been carrying, and they spent the rest of the evening in their usual silence. But something had shifted. She could feel it, faint and fragile as the first cold breath of a Tennessee autumn. Something between them had changed. She was not foolish enough to name it yet. But she felt it, and she did not put it in the fire. Chang. It was Agnes who gave her the information that changed everything. Not deliberately, Agnes was loyal to Nathaniel with a ferocity that Elizabeth respected, but inadvertently, on a morning in late October, when they were preserving the last of the kitchen garden's harvest, and Agnes's guard was down, and she was remembering. "He wasn't always like this, you know," Agnes said, working a jar with practiced efficiency. "Before the war." Elizabeth kept her hands moving. "What was he like before?" Agnes was quiet for a moment. "Easier." He laughed. He had men he called friends. He was going to be married before he enlisted. Elizabeth looked up. "I didn't know that." She didn't wait. Agnes said it without judgment, just stating a fact. Word came back that he'd been wounded, that he might not recover, and she married someone else inside the year. And then he did recover, and he came home, and there was no one. She looked down at her hands. And then the talk started. About what happened in the war. About the men who died. "What talk?" Elizabeth asked carefully. Agnes shook her head. "Not my story to tell, ma'am, but it wasn't true. What they said wasn't true. Any man who was there would tell you so. But the ones who weren't there." She set down her jar. "People like a story that makes them feel better about themselves. And a hero's harder to feel superior to than a man with a sin on his conscience. Elizabeth set down her own jar. She thought about a woman burning a letter in a fireplace. She thought about a county that had decided who she was based on a night she sat in the dirt to help a stranger. Agnes, she said quietly. Who was he before? And Agnes, who had clearly been waiting for someone to ask for a very long time, told her. That night, Elizabeth sat by her window long after the house had gone quiet. Outside, the October dark was thick and soft, the river barely visible through the trees. The first suggestion of autumn color just beginning to show in the hardwood's upper branches. She thought about what Agnes had told her. She thought about the boy who had grown up on this land and gone to war believing in something and come back to find that the thing he'd believed in, the idea that service and sacrifice meant something that a man could do right and be recognized for it, had turned out to be a story people told only when it was convenient. She thought about what it must mean to carry a guilt that isn't yours. She thought about the way he stood in doorways. She thought about the smile quick and gone at the fence line. She thought about a man who sent medicine and food to sick neighbors without wanting anyone to know. A man who was trying to undo his father's damage to the land. A man who asked quietly in a doorway, "Are you all right?" and meant it. You were not ruined by what happened, she thought. Not to anyone, just to the dark and the river and the October air. You were wounded by carrying it alone. She stayed at the window for a long time. She did not yet know what she was going to do with any of this. She only knew that Nathaniel Hayes was not the man the county had decided he was. And she knew with the same cold certainty she had felt standing in that courthouse doorway in her plain white dress, that she was not going to let the story stand uncorrected. Not this time. Not for him. The morning after Elizabeth burned her uncle's letter, she woke before sunrise. Not because she couldn't sleep. She had slept deeply and without dreams the way a person sleeps when they have made a decision they don't yet know how to name. She woke because the house was already moving. She could hear it, the low creak of floorboards from the direction of the back stair, the distant sound of the kitchen door, the muffled strike of boots on packed earth outside. Nathaniel was already up. She dressed quickly and went downstairs. Agnes was at the stove, and she looked up with the particular expression of someone who had expected to be alone and was not displeased to find otherwise. Elizabeth poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot and stood at the kitchen table and said without preamble, "Where does he go in the mornings before the light?" Agnes turned back to the stove. "The river mostly, walks the fence line. Sometimes he goes to the old cemetery on the North Ridge, his mother's buried there. Every morning. Most." Agnes paused. "He doesn't sleep well. Hasn't since he came back." Elizabeth drank her coffee. She did not ask the next question aloud. She had learned to hold questions until she had enough information to use them, but she thought it clearly. What does a man carry that is heavy enough to keep him from sleep 3 years after the carrying began? She thought she was beginning to understand. She did not follow him to the river. That would have been a trespass, not in the legal sense, but in the human one. And she had learned early that Nathaniel Hayes had walls that would not be scaled by force. They could only be found to have doors if she was patient enough to look. Instead, she went to the estate office. She had been in there a number of times now, always by invitation or permission, always with a stated purpose. This morning she had a purpose, but it was not the one she would have named aloud. She sat at the corner of the desk where he sometimes let her review documents with him, and she opened the oldest set of account ledgers she could find, records going back 15 years before the war, before Nathaniel had taken over the property. She was looking for something she couldn't quite name. A pattern. A before and after. What she found over the course of 2 hours was this. Hayes Plantation had been a different place before 1812. The record showed a property managed with an aggression that bordered on recklessness. Land pushed hard expenditures high. The balance sheet sustained more by the scale of operations than by any efficiency or care. Nathaniel's father, from everything the numbers suggested, had been a man who believed in extraction. Take from the land. Take from the workers. Take and see how long the taking could last. And then, starting in 1813, the year Nathaniel returned from the war, everything changed. Slower rotations, reduced expenditure on the most punishing equipment, wages that increased incrementally year by year, a new medical account for worker injuries and illness, small notations in the margin of the ledgers that she was beginning to recognize as Nathaniel's handwriting, careful angular script, asking questions of his own records. Is this the best use? Can this be done more fairly? What does this cost the men who do it? She sat back from the ledgers. A man who came home from war and spent 3 years quietly trying to make his inherited world less cruel. And nobody knew, because he had not told anyone. Because the story they preferred, the broken soldier, the dangerous recluse, the man to be feared and avoided, required no evidence and offered the comfort of a simple explanation. She heard his boots in the corridor. She did not close the ledgers. She left them open on the desk and sat with her hands folded and waited. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. He took in the open ledgers. He took in her face. "You've been here a while," he said, "since before sunrise." He came into the room slowly. He looked at the ledger she had open, the 1815 account with its marginal notations. His jaw tightened barely perceptibly. "You're reading my notes," he said. "I am. Those aren't meant for other people. I know." She did not apologize. "Mr. Hayes, when you reduced the land pressure on the south and east fields in 1814, the yield dropped 16% in the short term. The county records show 2 neighboring plantations outperformed you that year. I imagine there was criticism." His expression shifted. Not opening exactly, but a crack in the surface. There was. "And you continued anyway?" "The soil needed it." "Yes," she said. "It did." She paused. "And the medical account. That's not standard practice for hired labor in this county." "No. It costs you money." "I'm aware of what it costs." She looked at him directly. "Why do you hide it?" The crack in his expression closed. He moved to the desk and closed the ledger, not roughly, but with finality. "Mrs. Hayes." "Elizabeth," she said. "We've been married 4 months. I think you can call me Elizabeth." He stopped. Looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Then quietly, "Elizabeth." It was the first time he had said her name, just her name without title. It sounded different than she had expected, careful, like something he was testing the weight of. "Why do you hide it?" she asked again. A long silence. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the fields he'd spent 3 years trying to heal. "Because it's easier," he said, "to let people think the worst of you than to let them think well of you and wait for the moment they change their minds." She absorbed that. "That's a very particular kind of armor," she said. He didn't answer, but his shoulders moved, not quite a flinch. Something more controlled than that. "I understand it," she said. "Better than you might think." He turned then and looked at her, and she let him look, let him see whatever was in her face, without trying to arrange it into something more palatable. "I know you do," he said. And that was all he said. But the way he said it, quiet, and without any of his usual careful distance, told her that he meant more by it than the words contained. November came in cold and fast, the way Tennessee Novembers did, arriving without apology and making itself at home. The river went gray, and the hardwoods stripped themselves bare, and the work of the plantation shifted from the fields to the preparation for winter, storing, mending, reinforcing, planning. Elizabeth had, by this point, established herself in the household in the way that competent people establish themselves anywhere, not by announcing her presence, but by making herself indispensable. The supplemental ledger she had created was now a standard part of the estate's record-keeping. The kitchen garden had been properly put to rest for the winter, and the yield records documented. The household staff, initially wary, had settled into something easier in her presence. Not familiarity, not yet, but comfort. Mrs. Pruitt stopped looking at her with that particular anxiety she'd carried like a second apron. Agnes started saving the good flour for when Elizabeth came to the kitchen. Tom Hicks, the field foreman, had taken to stopping by the office when she was working there, asking questions about the south field cover crop and whether she'd read anything about drainage improvements. She had. She had read quite a bit about drainage improvements. Nathaniel noticed all of it. She could tell he noticed because he had stopped looking surprised when he came upon her in conversation with members of his household. The surprise had been replaced with something else, something she did not examine too closely because she had made a rule for herself early in this marriage, one revelation at a time. One carefully opened door before reaching for the next. The rule had served her well, until the night she found him in the study at 2 a.m, sitting in the dark with a glass of whiskey he had not touched. She had come down for water, a mundane reason for being awake, an accidental collision with whatever private crisis was unfolding in the study. She saw the light under the door, and she stood in the corridor for a moment, and then she knocked. "Come," he said. She opened the door. He was in the chair by the fire, which had burned down to almost nothing. The whiskey glass on the table beside him, his hands loose in his lap, his face in an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the careful blankness, not the measured watchfulness, something rawer, something that made him look for a moment much younger and much more exhausted than 35 years should allow. "I didn't know you were awake," she said. A foolish thing to say, obviously, he was awake, but she needed a moment to find her footing. "I'm often awake at this hour." He said it without inflection, a statement of fact offered without self-pity. She looked at the untouched glass. "Do you want me to leave?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "No." She crossed the room and sat in the chair across from his. The fire was nearly out and the room was cold, but she did not suggest reviving it. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. He looked at the dead fire for a long time. "There was a man named Calloway," he said finally. "Sergeant James Calloway. He was 22 years old and he had a wife in Kentucky, and he had shown me a drawing she'd made of their farm, just a pencil sketch. Nothing remarkable, but he carried it in his coat pocket, and he'd taken it out and shown it to me the week before the engagement at the Chateau Guay." Elizabeth said nothing. She barely breathed. "I gave an order," Nathaniel said. "I believed the intelligence we had. I believed the position was clear. I was wrong about the intelligence, and I was wrong about the position, and Calloway was one of 11 men who did not come back from it." He paused. "He was the one I knew by name. But they all had names." The room was very quiet. "What the county says," Elizabeth said carefully, "about your command, is that I was reckless, that I cared more about advancement than the men under me." His voice was flat, precise. The voice of a man who has rehearsed his own condemnation so many times it has worn smooth. "That is not true. But what is true is that I made a mistake that cost men their lives, and I have to live with that, and I don't—" He stopped. "You don't believe you're entitled to not living with it," she said. He looked at her. "You think the guilt is a debt," she said, "and paying it sleeping badly, keeping yourself apart, refusing to let anyone think well of you. That's how you're paying it." His jaw tightened. "That's a very neat interpretation." "Is it wrong?" A long silence. "Calloway believed I knew what I was doing," Nathaniel said. "He followed that order because he trusted me." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "He did. And you made the best decision you could with the information you had, and it was wrong, and he died." She met his eyes directly. "That is a terrible thing. I'm not going to tell you it isn't. But there is a difference between a mistake made in good faith and a sin. And what you're doing this—" She gestured briefly at the dark room, the untouched glass, the dying fire. "This isn't penance. It's just suffering. And Calloway's wife in Kentucky, with her pencil sketch of a farm, she is not better served by your suffering." Nathaniel stared at her. She had said more than she intended. She could feel the edge of it, the place where she had gone past. What was safe past the careful, measured distance she had maintained into territory that was intimate in a way that their 4 months of proximity had never quite been. She held his gaze and did not retreat from it. "Who told you about Calloway?" he asked finally. His voice was different, lower, less controlled. "No one. You just told me." He looked away. Something moved across his face. Not anger. Something she might, if she were less cautious, have called relief. "You're a very unusual woman," he said. "I've been told that generally as a criticism." It wasn't a criticism. She looked at the dying fire. "Then I'll take it as a compliment." He reached forward and picked up the whiskey glass. He set it aside without drinking from it, and he looked at her in the firelight with that expression she was beginning to understand. The one that was not coldness, had never been coldness, was something closer to a man who had forgotten that being seen was possible, and was only now slowly in this cold room in November, beginning to remember. "Good night, Elizabeth," he said. "Good night, Nathaniel." She said his name the same way he had said hers earlier, testing its weight, and she saw in the instant before she turned away that it landed. December brought a visitor that neither of them expected. His name was Robert Mercer, and he arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, without announcement, riding a horse that cost more than most men in the county earned in a year. He was somewhere in his 40s, well dressed in the way that required deliberate effort, with a face that had been handsome once and had since sharpened into something less pleasant. He introduced himself as an old associate of Nathaniel's father. Elizabeth was in the front parlor when he arrived. She heard the knock, heard Mrs. Pruitt's voice, heard the visitor's voice, assured and expansive, the voice of a man accustomed to filling rooms, and she was already on her feet before Mrs. Pruitt appeared in the parlor doorway. "A Mr. Mercer, ma'am. He's asking for Mr. Hayes." "Tell him Mr. Hayes will be with him shortly," Elizabeth said. "And put him in the east sitting room, not the parlor." Mrs. Pruitt blinked. The parlor was the receiving room. The east sitting room was smaller, less comfortable, and had worse light. It was in the domestic architecture of a household a signal of a particular kind of welcome. "Yes, ma'am," Mrs. Pruitt said with the tone of a woman who was learning to read her employer's wife and found the reading instructive. Elizabeth went to find Nathaniel. He was in the south field with Tom Hicks, inspecting the winter rye she had suggested. He came back to the house when she told him about the visitor, and she watched his face go through a series of expressions in rapid succession. Recognition, wariness, something that might have been anger, before settling into the careful blankness. "Mercer," he said, "you know him." "I know what he wants." He walked past her toward the house. Then he stopped and turned back. "Will you sit in?" She looked at him. He had never asked her to be present for business. She had been present in the office in the evenings, in the gradual way of a woman who made herself part of the fabric of a household, but always at her own initiative, never by his invitation. "Yes," she said. Robert Mercer rose when they entered the east sitting room, and he turned his expansive smile on Elizabeth. First, the practiced smile of a man who understood that women were often more useful than men gave them credit for. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. "A pleasure. I had not heard Nathaniel had married." "Most people hadn't," Elizabeth said pleasantly. "Won't you sit down?" Mercer sat. He looked at Nathaniel, who had remained standing. "You look well, Nathaniel. Tennessee agrees with you." "What do you want, Robert?" Mercer's smile adjusted, widened slightly, as if the directness were charming. "Always straight to it. I always admired that about you." He glanced at Elizabeth, weighing her, and she met the glance without expression. "I'll be equally direct then. I'm putting together a consortium land acquisition along the Cumberland River Basin. Several significant properties, the kind of opportunity that comes along once in a generation." He leaned forward. "Hayes Plantation is the keystone, Nathaniel. Without this land, the rest of the assembly falls apart. I'm prepared to offer a price that will—" "No," Nathaniel said. Mercer blinked. "You haven't heard the figure." "I don't need to." "Nathaniel, this is a business conversation, surely." "This land isn't for sale." Nathaniel's voice was even, but there was an edge under it now, the edge Elizabeth had heard only a few times in moments of quiet intensity. It was never going to be for sale. I don't know who told you it might be, but they were wrong. Mercer looked at him for a long moment. Then that smile returned, and it was a different smile this time, cooler, more calculating. Your father thought differently, he said. Charles and I had quite a few conversations about this property's future. He believed he often said that you wouldn't hold it, that you'd come back from the war wrong one way or another, and the land would need new stewardship. The room went very still. Elizabeth watched Nathaniel's face. He did not react the way Mercer expected him to. He did not tighten or flush or retreat. He looked at Mercer with an expression that Elizabeth recognized not coldness, but the thing that lived below coldness, the bedrock that didn't move. My father, Nathaniel said, made a great many predictions about my future. He was wrong about most of them. He moved toward the door and held it open. I'll have someone bring your horse around, Robert. Mercer rose slowly, smoothing his coat. He looked at Nathaniel, then at Elizabeth, and the calculation in his eyes was visible now, not hidden well enough by the smile. It's a generous offer, he said. I'd encourage you to think carefully before declining it permanently. It's been declined, Elizabeth said. Both men looked at her. She kept her voice even and her hands still. Mr. Mercer, she said, I wonder if you might clarify something for me. You mentioned conversations with Mr. Hayes's father about the property. When did those conversations occur? Charles Hayes passed in 1812, before my husband returned from the war. Which means the conversations you're describing took place without Mr. Hayes's knowledge or consent regarding land that wasn't Mr. Charles Hayes's to promise. She tilted her head slightly. I do hope you haven't been conducting your business on the basis of an expectation that was never legal to begin with. That would be unfortunate. To me, it might. Silence. Mercer looked at her with an expression that had shed the last of its pleasantness. Your wife, he said to Nathaniel, is very well informed. Yes, Nathaniel said. She is. Mercer left without another word. Mrs. Pruitt, who had unquestionably been listening from the corridor, removed herself with great efficiency when they came out of the sitting room. Nathaniel looked at Elizabeth for a moment, just a moment, measuring something. The conversations with my father, he said. How did you know they were improper? Because you didn't know about them. A man like Mercer doesn't arrange private discussions with a father about a son's property unless the intention is to move before the son can object. She walked toward the office. He'll come back. I know. Or he'll find another angle. She paused at the office door. I'd like to look at the deed records, just to be certain everything is properly registered and there are no encumbrances I should know about. Nathaniel followed her into the office. He pulled the deed box from the lower shelf himself and set it on the desk. Elizabeth, he said. She looked up from the box. Thank you, he said. Quiet, direct, unadorned. No careful distance. No measured removal. She held his gaze. You would have done the same without me, she said. I would have shown him the door, he agreed. You showed him what was behind it. He paused. There's a difference. She opened the deed box and got to work. Just what? She found the first discrepancy on the third day of searching. It was small, a reference number in a county registration document that didn't match the corresponding entry in the original deed. A clerical error, possibly. The kind of thing that could sit in a file for years without mattering. Or the kind of thing that could be used by someone who knew how to cloud a title. She set that document aside and kept looking. She found the second discrepancy on the fourth day. A boundary notation in a survey document from 1809 pre-war, predating Nathaniel's ownership, that placed the eastern fence line of the property 40 yards further west than the current physical fence line. Again, possibly an old error. Possibly nothing. Or possibly something. She brought both documents to Nathaniel that evening at dinner, and she watched his face as he read them. My father managed the legal filings, he said. Yes. And Mercer was his associate. Yes. He looked at her. You think they're connected? I think it's worth finding out, she said. before Mercer's next move. Nathaniel set the documents down. He was quiet for a long moment. The particular quiet that she had learned meant he was making a decision, not evading one. "There's an attorney in Nashville," he said. "Thomas Avery. He's honest, one of the few I know of. I'll write to him tonight." "I've drafted a letter," she said. She produced it from beside her plate. "I wasn't certain you'd want me to." He took the letter. He read it. He looked at her across the dinner table with the expression she had come to know, the one that was not quite surprise, not quite something else suspended between the two. "You were certain I'd want you to," he said. "I was hopeful," she corrected. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but its shadow. "It's a good letter," he said. "It's a clear letter. That seemed more important than good." He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. "Elizabeth," he said, and the way he said it now, without preamble, without ceremony, had become its own particular sound. Her name in his mouth, comfortable in a way that nothing about this arrangement had been in the beginning. "What made you start looking at the deeds before Mercer came?" She was quiet for a moment. "The ledgers," she said. "Your father's way of doing things. A man who believes in taking, who takes from land, from workers, from everyone around him, doesn't stop at the legal. He just finds ways to make the taking look legitimate." She met his eyes. "I wanted to know what he'd left behind." Nathaniel was very still. "And if you'd found something worse?" he asked. "Something that endangered the property, endangered your position here. Then I would have found it before Mercer could use it against you." She said it simply because it was simple. That would have been better than the alternative. He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she became aware with an acuteness she had been carefully avoiding for weeks of exactly how small the dinner table was, and how the lamplight sat between them, and how different this silence was from the first silence they had shared 4 months ago at opposite ends of this same table. "I don't understand you," he said finally. His voice was low, honest in a way he wasn't always honest. "You do," she said. "You're just not used to it." He looked down at his plate. Something moved across his face, that shadow of a thing she was beginning to call in the privacy of her own thoughts by its real name. She picked up her fork and let him have the moment. Thomas Avery, the Nashville attorney, arrived 3 days before Christmas. He was a small man with quick eyes and ink-stained fingers, and the specific manner of a person who has spent years dealing with other people's disasters and has learned not to be surprised by them. He sat in the estate office with the deed box open before him and worked in silence for the better part of a morning while Elizabeth and Nathaniel sat on opposite sides of the room. At noon he looked up. "These are not clerical errors," he said. Elizabeth had known. She had known since the 4th day when she found the 3rd discrepancy. But knowing and hearing it confirmed are different things, and she felt the confirmation settle through her with a weight that was almost physical. Nathaniel didn't move. "Explain." "The boundary notation, the registration discrepancy, and a 3rd item, a conveyance document from 1810 that references a right-of-way agreement your father signed, taken together. They create a legal foundation for a challenge to your ownership of the eastern third of this property." Avery set his reading glasses on the table. "It's subtle. Someone would need to know exactly what to look for. But it's there, and it's not accidental." "Can it be corrected?" Elizabeth asked. "Most of it. The boundary survey can be redone and the discrepancy documented as an error. It's clearly wrong, and a competent surveyor will say so. The registration issue can be refiled. The conveyance document is more complex." He hesitated. "The right-of-way agreement, if the party to it can be found, and if they choose to enforce it rather than renegotiate." "What party?" Nathaniel said. Avery looked at the document. "A Robert Mercer," he said. "Of Nashville." The room went very, very quiet. And then Nathaniel Hayes, who Elizabeth had never heard raise his voice, said a single word that she chose charitably to attribute to the occasion. "He set this up years ago," Elizabeth said. "Not a question. Before the war. The conveyance, the registration, all of it." "The timeline would support that," Avery said carefully. Elizabeth stood up and went to the window. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass and looked out at the fields that Nathaniel had spent 3 years healing the south field with its cover crop. The east fields where the soil was slowly remembering how to produce the fence line where she had watched him smile. His father's land. His father's damage. And now his father's business partner circling back to collect on arrangements made before Nathaniel had any power to prevent them. She turned around. "Can we counter it?" she asked Avery. "With the right evidence and the right argument, yes. But it will require—" "Tell me what you need," she said. And she sat back down and took out her pen and she began to write. And beside her across the desk, Nathaniel Hayes watched her work with an expression that she did not look at directly, because if she had, she would have had to name it. And she was not ready quite yet to name it. But she was getting close. Thomas Avery stayed 4 days. He slept in the East guest room and ate Agnes's cooking with the focused appreciation of a man who spent most of his life in boarding houses, and he worked from before breakfast until after dinner, spread across the estate office desk with documents Elizabeth had never seen, and documents she had found herself, and documents Nathaniel had retrieved from a locked box in the back of the storage room. Records he had never looked at closely, because they had belonged to his father, and looking at his father's things too closely had always felt like reaching into dark water without knowing what was at the bottom. Now they had no choice but to reach. The conveyance document, Avery said on the second evening, was signed by your father in 1810, 2 years before his death, in exchange for a payment of, he squinted at the figure, $400. $400, Nathaniel repeated. Flat. A right-of-way agreement, ostensibly. The language is vague enough to be useful to either party depending on how you read it, and deliberately so. Your father agreed to grant Mercer access rights to the eastern corridor of the property for the stated purpose of river transit in exchange for that payment. Avery set the document down. But the agreement also contains a clause buried in the third paragraph that allows Mercer to exercise a purchase option on the eastern acreage if the right-of-way is, quote, materially altered or obstructed. Elizabeth had already found that clause. She had read it 4 times to be certain she was reading it correctly. And the fence line discrepancy in the 1809 survey makes it appear as though the current fence obstructs the right-of-way corridor. Yes. Avery looked at Nathaniel. Whether that obstruction was created before or after your father signed the agreement is at this point impossible to determine conclusively. But the practical effect is that Mercer can argue with some legal foundation that he holds a purchase option on 300 acres of your best river bottom land. 300 acres! Elizabeth had done the calculation. It was the most productive section of the property. The fields Nathaniel had been restoring the section that accounted for nearly 40% of the plantation's agricultural output. He planned this before the war, Nathaniel said. Not a question. The timing suggests it, Avery said. He knew I was enlisting. He knew my father was in declining health. He expected— Nathaniel stopped. He expected the property to be vulnerable, Elizabeth said. Either because you didn't return, or because you returned and he could, as he put it, offer a generous price to a man who didn't have the standing to refuse it. She looked at Avery. What do we need? Avery folded his hands on the desk. To defeat the right-of-way claim, you need to demonstrate that the survey discrepancy was either fraudulent or predates the agreement, which would undermine the obstruction argument. The cleanest way to do that is a new survey by a certified county surveyor, conducted officially with documentation that the current fence line matches older records. He paused. And you need to find out whether Mercer has already filed the purchase option with the county clerk. Okay. Nathaniel went very still. Has he? Elizabeth asked. I don't know yet. I'll need to check the Nashville records. Avery looked at both of them. If he's already filed, it becomes a public legal matter, and considerably more complicated. If he hasn't, you have time to address the underlying documents before he can move. How much time? Elizabeth asked. Enough. If we move quickly. Elizabeth looked at Nathaniel. He was staring at the document, his jaw set, his hands on the desk surface, not gripping anything, just resting there, as if he were feeling the grain of the wood beneath his palms. She had seen him look at the land like that before, as though it were something he was responsible for rather than something he owned. "Then we move quickly," she said. Avery rode for Nashville the next morning before sunrise. He took copies of the key documents and a letter of authorization from Nathaniel and a second letter from Elizabeth. She had drafted it herself late the previous night and slid it under the office door with a note. "In case my authority is needed. I believe it may be." She didn't know if he would use it. She knew she was right to include it. The house felt different after Avery left. Not smaller exactly, more focused. The way a room feels when everyone in it understands that something real is at stake. Nathaniel was in the office when she came downstairs. He had not slept, she could tell by the set of his shoulders and the particular stillness of a man who has been sitting in the same position for too long. "You should eat something," she said from the doorway. "I'm not hungry." She came in anyway, set a cup of coffee on the corner of the desk, and sat in her usual chair. He didn't thank her, but he picked up the cup. "Tell me about Mercer," she said. "Not the business history. Tell me what kind of man he is." Nathaniel turned the cup in his hands. "He was my father's closest associate for 20 years. They were alike in the ways that mattered to both of them. They believed money was the only honest language, and that any transaction could be justified if the price was right." He paused. "When I was young, I thought Mercer was impressive. He had a way of making you feel that his approval meant something. And later I understood that men who are skilled at making you feel valued are usually skilled at identifying what you're worth to them." He set the cup down. "My father trusted him absolutely, which means either my father was a fool or they had an understanding I didn't know about." "Or both," Elizabeth said. Nathaniel looked at her. "Or both." "Does he have allies in the county people who would support his claim?" "He has business partners, men who stand to profit from the consortium he mentioned." He paused. "And he has—" He stopped. "Tell me," she said. "He has a relationship with Judge Harlan Dodd, Nashville Circuit Court. They're not friends. Mercer doesn't have friends, but they have history, business history." He looked at the desk. "If this goes to a legal hearing, Dodd is the most likely judge." Elizabeth absorbed that. "Can we request a different judge? On what grounds?" "That I suspect he might be partial, without evidence. That's an insult to the court." "Then we need the evidence to be overwhelming enough that Dodd can't rule against it without destroying his own credibility." She thought for a moment. "The survey. Who is the county surveyor?" "A man named Briggs. He's competent and, as far as I know, honest." "Can you send for him today?" Nathaniel looked at her. "You want to get ahead of the filing. I want to create a public record that exists before Mercer can establish his own version of events." She leaned forward slightly. "If Briggs conducts an official survey and documents that the current fence line is consistent with the property's historical use, that record will exist whether or not Mercer files the option. And if he files after the survey is on record, the fraudulent character of the discrepancy becomes visible," Nathaniel said. "Exactly." He stood up. He picked up his coat from the back of his chair and put it on with the deliberate efficiency of a man who has decided to act. "I'll ride for Briggs," he said. "Take Tom Hicks with you," she said. "Hicks has worked this land for 8 years. His knowledge of where the fence line has always been is worth having on record." Nathaniel stopped at the door. He turned and looked at her. The full, direct look that he gave her, rarely that she had come to understand, was not withholding, but concentration, the look of a man who was genuinely seeing something. "You've done this before," he said. "This kind of strategic thinking, counter moves." "I've watched people do it to me," she said. "It's instructive." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll be back before dark." "I know," she said. And she went to the desk and got to work. Briggs came 2 days later, a solid, methodical man who understood immediately what was being asked and why, and who, to his credit, did not ask any questions beyond the professional ones. He spent a full day on the eastern boundary with Tom Hicks and two of the field hands running measurements and checking old stakes and documenting everything in the careful witnessed record that was the language of county law. His findings were exactly what Elizabeth had hoped for. The current fence line matched a 1799 survey, the oldest on record for the property, within normal tolerances for the surveying instruments of the period. The 1809 survey that showed the discrepancy had been conducted by a surveyor named Fitch, who Briggs noted with professional displeasure was no longer practicing in Tennessee. The discrepancy was, in Briggs's formal written opinion, either an error of instrument calibration or an error of documentation, and was not reflected in any physical evidence on the ground. Elizabeth read the report twice. Then she made 2 copies in her own hand, had them witnessed by Mrs. Pruitt and Agnes and Tom Hicks, and sent the originals to Avery in Nashville, with a letter explaining what she needed him to do with them. That evening, Nathaniel came to the office where she was working. He stood in the doorway for a moment, in the way he did checking the room before entering it, and then he came in and sat down across from her. "Avery sent a rider," he said. "Mercer filed the purchase option 3 days ago." She looked up. Before or after Briggs completed his survey? After. 2 days after. She felt something relax in her chest. Something she hadn't known was tight. Then he filed knowing we were conducting a survey. He was trying to get ahead of it. "He failed," Nathaniel said. "He failed the first move," she corrected. "He still has the agreement document. He still has Judge Dodd. And—" She set down her pen. "He knows we know about those things." Nathaniel studied her face. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking a man like Mercer doesn't make one move at a time." She looked at the desk at the organized documents, the ledger copies, the correspondence file she had built over the past 2 weeks. "He came here expecting to deal with you alone. Now he knows he isn't dealing with you alone. He'll adjust." "How?" "By going for a different weakness." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then slowly, "You mean he'll go for Virginia?" She met his eyes. "Your uncle," he said. "The scandal. Your reputation." She had known it was coming. She had known since Mercer looked at her in the east sitting room with that calculating smile, had known that the moment he left this house, he would look for every piece of information that might be used to destabilize her position here. "A wife with a compromised reputation," she said, keeping her voice even, "cannot legally act as her husband's agent in business matters. Her character is open to challenge. Her judgment is open to challenge." She paused. "If he can undermine me publicly, with enough force that people believe it, then everything I've done here, every document I've touched, every letter I've written can be called into question." "That's his next move," Nathaniel said. "Not a question." "Yes." He stood up from his chair, and he went to the window, and he stood with his back to her for a long moment. She could read his shoulders, now had learned to read them the way she read ledger columns for what they contained rather than what they displayed. They were not stooped. They were not the shoulders of a man who was yielding. "Then we need to address Virginia before he does," he said. "Yes." He turned. "The man Whitmore, the one you helped on the road, is he still in Charlottesville?" "As far as I know." "And he would tell the truth about what happened." "He always told the truth about what happened. The problem was that nobody wanted to hear it." She paused. "And my uncle, he found it more useful not to hear it." Nathaniel came back to the desk. He stood on the other side of it close enough that she had to look up at him, and he looked down at her with that careful, concentrated expression. "I'm going to write to Whitmore," he said. "And I'm going to write to 3 men I know in Charlottesville who can conduct a quiet inquiry into how the rumor started and who benefited from it." He said it plainly, without drama, the way he said everything that mattered. "I should have done it months ago." "You didn't know what was coming," she said. "No, but I knew what had been done to you, and I—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. "I told myself it wasn't my business, that we had an arrangement, and the terms of the arrangement didn't include—" "It's all right," she said. "It isn't." He said it quietly, but clearly without any of his usual careful removal. "It was a failure of basic decency, and I want you to know I understand that." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Write to your men in Charlottesville, and write to Whitmore. I'll draft the inquiries tonight if you give me their names." He gave her their names. He sat down across from her while she wrote, and he read through the Briggs survey report while she drafted the correspondence, and for a while the only sounds in the office were the fire and the scratch of her pen. It was, she thought, a very particular kind of intimacy, the kind built from shared purpose and late nights, and the understanding that two people were fighting for the same thing. She was almost afraid of how much she did not want to lose it. The answer came from Charlottesville faster than she expected. 14 days. A letter to Nathaniel from a man named Porter, one of his contacts in the county, that arrived on a bright January morning, with the particular weight of something that had been written quickly and urgently. Nathaniel read it at the breakfast table. Elizabeth watched his face go still, in a way she recognized not the careful stillness of practiced restraint, but the stillness of a man who has just been handed something that clarifies everything. He passed the letter across the table without a word. She read it. Her hands were steady. She made a point of keeping them steady. Porter's letter described in careful and documented detail what his inquiry had found. The rumor about Elizabeth Carter and Daniel Whitmore had not originated among the townspeople of Charlottesville. It had originated in the office of William Carter, her uncle. Specifically, from conversations William had held with two business associates in the weeks after the carriage accident, conversations in which he had described his niece's behavior as improper and cause for concern. Before a single word of public gossip had been spoken, he had started it. Her uncle had started it. Elizabeth set the letter on the table. She sat for a moment with that fact, just sat with it, because she had suspected something like it for a long time, and suspicion and confirmation were different things, and the difference had a weight to it. "Elizabeth," Nathaniel said. "I'm all right," she said, which was not exactly true, but was true enough to be worth saying. "He manufactured the scandal," Nathaniel said. "Your uncle, to force the marriage." She kept her voice level. "He needed me out of Charlottesville. There was something about the estate, my father's estate. He was managing it as executor after my father died, and if I had stayed and asked the right questions—" She stopped. "I was asking questions about the accounts, about certain decisions he'd made in the 2 years after my father died. He knew I was close to finding something." Nathaniel looked at her across the breakfast table. "Your inheritance. My father's estate was worth more than William ever disclosed to me." She thought of the ledgers she had reviewed in the weeks after her father's death, the ones William had given her carefully edited, showing a near valueless remnant. She thought of the questions she had started asking, and the speed with which her reputation had suddenly collapsed. "I couldn't prove it then. I didn't have access to the records, and once the scandal broke, I was too busy surviving it to pursue it. But now," Nathaniel said carefully, "you have access to a lawyer." She looked at him. "Avery," he said. "He's in Nashville, but he has contacts in Virginia." He paused. "If there are records to be found, he can find them." She felt something shift in her chest, a careful, fragile shift, the kind that happens when you have been carrying something alone for a long time, and someone else reaches out and puts their hand on the other side of it. That would be— She stopped, started again. "That would be a significant undertaking. I'm aware. It might not produce anything conclusive." "It might not," he agreed. "But William Carter has apparently built his position on the assumption that you have no one to help you look." He met her eyes directly. He was wrong about that. She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. She looked down at the letter in her hands, and she thought about a girl of 21 sitting in a house that was no longer hers, reading accounts that had been falsified, and not yet knowing who she could trust. "Write to Avery," she said finally. "Tell him what we need." "I already have," Nathaniel said. "I sent the writer before breakfast." She looked up. He was watching her with that expression, not quite the shadow of a smile, not quite something else. The expression that lived in the narrow space between restraint and everything restraint was holding back. "You were certain I'd want you to," she said, echoing his words back to him from months before. "I was hopeful," he said. And there it was. Her own word in his mouth with a weight she had not given it when she first spoke it. She looked down at the letter again. Her hands were still steady, but her heart was doing something she had not given it permission to do. Robert Mercer made his next move on a Thursday afternoon in late January. He did not come to the plantation. He was smarter than that. He had learned from the December visit that coming to Hayes Plantation meant dealing with both of them, and dealing with both of them was considerably more complicated than he had anticipated. Instead, he went to the county seat. He filed a formal legal challenge to the property survey with the Davidson County Clerk's Office, citing the 1809 Fitch Survey as the authoritative document and requesting that Briggs's survey be set aside pending a court review. He accompanied the filing with a sworn affidavit attesting to the right-of-way agreement and the purchase option, and he submitted as a supplementary document a letter from William Carter of Charlottesville, Virginia, attesting to Elizabeth Carter Hayes's history of improper conduct and her unsuitability as a reliable agent in legal or financial matters. Avery sent the news by express rider. It arrived on a Friday evening. Nathaniel read the rider's message in the front hall, still in his coat, just in from the fields. Elizabeth was on the stairs when he came in, and she saw his face as he read, and she came down the stairs and stood beside him and read it over his arm. The William Carter letter. She had expected it. She had told Nathaniel to expect it. The knowing did not make it easier. "He gave Mercer a weapon," she said. "Your uncle," Nathaniel said, "is a fool." She looked at him. His jaw was tight. His voice had that edge in it, but it was not the cold, controlled edge she had first heard. This was something different, something warmer, and considerably more dangerous. "He's not a fool," she said. "He calculated that Mercer's resources and legal position were stronger than mine." "Than yours." Nathaniel folded the message. "He didn't calculate mine." "No," she said. "He didn't." Nathaniel looked at her. And then he said something she had not expected, in a voice she had not heard from him before. Not the careful distance, not the measured restraint, but something direct and certain and entirely unguarded. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I told you when we married that this was a matter of convenience, that you needed protection from scandal, and I needed a wife who would not ask questions." He held her gaze. "I was wrong about what I needed." She kept her face still, kept her hands still. "And I was wrong," he continued, "to let you spend the last 6 months building a case for my property and my reputation without being told clearly that this—" He gestured briefly between them at the hall at the house, at everything that had accumulated in 6 months of late nights and cold coffee and shared purpose, "is not a matter of convenience to me anymore." She breathed in slowly. "Nathaniel," she said. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I'm not—" He stopped, tried again. "I know what the arrangement was. I know I have no right to expect that your feelings have—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. She looked at him. She looked at this man who had spent 3 years punishing himself for a war and a mistake, and a woman who left, and a father who betrayed him, and who had spent the last 6 months being seen slowly, carefully, one closed door at a time, and who was standing in his own front hall, telling her the truth with every wall down, because he had somewhere in the last 6 months forgotten how to keep them up around her. "You are the least convenient thing that has ever happened to me," she said, "and I would not change a single day of it." Something broke open in his face, not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories, just opened. Quiet as a door someone has finally stopped holding shut. He reached out and took her hand. Not the quick courtesy touch from their wedding day here and gone in a breath. He took her hand and held it, and she felt the warmth of his work-roughened palm against her fingers, and she did not look away. "We're going to lose this case," she said, "if we let Mercer and my uncle define us before we can speak for ourselves." "I know," he said. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, not demanding, just present. "We need to go to Nashville," she said, "in person, before the hearing date." "I know. We need Whitmore's testimony, and we need Avery to file a counter motion challenging the Fitch survey on the grounds of demonstrable error. She was aware of his hand around hers, and was speaking through it, around it, the practical machinery of the problem running alongside the thing that was happening between them, inseparable now. "And I need to write to my uncle." Nathaniel looked at her. "What will you say to him?" She thought about William Carter's handwriting. She thought about a letter burning in a fireplace. She thought about a 21-year-old girl and falsified accounts and a reputation destroyed as a matter of financial calculation. "I'll tell him," she said clearly, "that I know what he did, to my father's estate and to my name, and that he has one opportunity to correct it before I make everything Avery has found a matter of public record." Nathaniel's hand tightened slightly on hers. "And if he refuses?" he asked. She met his eyes. "Then he refuses," she said, "and we proceed accordingly." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he raised her hand slowly, deliberately, and pressed his lips to her knuckles, brief and certain. "All right," he said. "Then we proceed accordingly." She felt it through her whole body, that small, certain touch, that quiet declaration. Outside, January was hard and cold, and the Cumberland River was running fast and gray in the early dark. Inside, in the front hall of Hayes Plantation, Elizabeth Hayes stood with her hand in her husband's and understood with a clarity she had not permitted herself until this moment that she was no longer fighting for survival. She was fighting for something she wanted to keep, and she was not going to lose it. The letter to William Carter took Elizabeth 3 drafts and most of a night. The first draft was too cold. She read it back and heard a stranger, a woman performing composure, every sentence polished to a remove that was its own kind of lie. She put it in the fire. The second draft was too much the other thing. She had not meant to let the anger come through, but it did in the third paragraph, in a sentence about her father that she read once and could not read again. She put that one in the fire too. The third draft was the truth written plainly, without armor and without excess. She told him she knew about the conversations with his business associates. She told him she knew the timeline, that he had begun spreading doubt about her character before a single public word had been spoken, which meant the scandal had not caught him by surprise, as he had always implied. It had been his tool, his solution to a problem she had been creating for him by asking the right questions about the wrong accounts. She told him that Thomas Avery of Nashville was currently in correspondence with 3 men in Charlottesville who were examining the estate records from the 2 years following her father's death, and that what they were finding was not consistent with the accounting William had provided to her. She told him that he had one opportunity to make this right before it became a public matter. She did not threaten. She did not plead. She stated facts and offered a choice, and she signed it, Elizabeth Carter Hayes, and she sealed it before she could change her mind. She slid it under the office door with a note for Nathaniel. "Please review before sending. I've tried to be fair." In the morning, she found the letter on the breakfast table, with a single line in his handwriting beneath her note. "It's more than fair. I'll send it today." They left for Nashville 4 days later. Avery had arranged lodgings and had already filed the counter-motion challenging the Fitch survey. The hearing was set for the second week of February, 3 weeks away, which was enough time if everything went well, and not enough if anything went wrong. The road to Nashville in January was cold and rutted and unpleasant, and they traveled it in the closed carriage with a lap blanket and 2 hours of quiet before Nathaniel said without preamble, "Tell me what you're worried about." Elizabeth looked at him. "Which specific worry would you like? The one you haven't said aloud yet?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the frozen fields moved past the carriage window, gray and still. "Judge Dodd," she said. "I've been thinking about Dodd." "So have I." "Avery says he's careful, that he won't rule against clear evidence simply to favor Mercer." She paused. "But a man doesn't have to rule against evidence to rule against us. He can find procedural grounds. He can question the standing of witnesses. He can—" "Question yours," Nathaniel said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mercer's letter includes your uncle's affidavit about your character. Dodd will have read it." "I know. And Dodd will know that you've been acting as my agent in preparing this case, reviewing documents, corresponding with witnesses, drafting counter motions." He looked at her directly. "In the letter Mercer filed, your uncle specifically challenges your credibility in legal and financial matters. If Dodd decides to take that challenge seriously, then everything I've touched is suspect," she said. "Yes, I've thought about it." And she turned to look at him. "And I think we need Whitmore in that courtroom. Not just his written testimony, him in person under oath in front of Dodd and anyone else who's there." She paused. "Because a written statement can be dismissed. A man standing in a courthouse saying this woman did nothing wrong, and I will swear it on my life, is considerably harder to dismiss." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "Avery sent for him." "I know. I wrote to him myself separately." She met Nathaniel's eyes. "I hope that was all right." "It was right," he said. The distinction was subtle, and she caught it immediately. "What did you say to him?" "I told him the truth. That his silence had cost me a great deal, and that I wasn't asking him to repair, that I was asking him to tell what he knew, because it was the honest thing to do, and because the time for leaving it unspoken had passed." She paused. "I told him I didn't hold him responsible for what my uncle did, but I told him that standing aside while a lie stands unchallenged is its own kind of choice, and I hoped he would make a different one." The carriage moved through a shallow ford and lurched back onto solid ground. "He'll come," Nathaniel said. "I think he will," she said. "I think he's been waiting for someone to ask him directly." Nathaniel looked at her. "You've been managing people's consciences for months." "I've been helping people do what they already wanted to do," she said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled, that small, quick thing that changed his whole face. "Reckon there is," he said. She looked at him for a moment. He almost never used that word, the easy vernacular, the ordinary speech of ordinary men. When he did, it sounded like him lowering something he'd been carrying. She found she liked it considerably. Nashville in February was cold and busy, and indifferent to their particular crisis, which was, Elizabeth reflected, something of a relief. Cities did not care about your problems. They simply moved around you, and you moved through them, and the anonymity was its own kind of freedom after 7 months in a county where everyone knew her name and the story attached to it. Avery met them at the lodging house, and he had the look of a man who had been working hard and had found several things he had not expected to find. He waited until they were inside and seated before he said, "Whitmore is here." Elizabeth exhaled. She had not known she was holding that breath. "He arrived yesterday," Avery continued. "He came voluntarily without subpoena, and he has provided a sworn statement that is—" He paused, choosing the word thorough. He was clearly aware that the moment required more than a brief account. "What does he say?" Nathaniel asked. "He says that on the night of the accident, Mrs. Hayes was the first person to stop, that she remained with him until the doctor arrived, that she behaved with complete propriety throughout, and that he personally attempted to correct the rumors when they reached him, but that his efforts were intercepted." Elizabeth went very still. Intercepted. He says he wrote a letter to William Carter at the time requesting that Carter publicly correct the account that was circulating. Carter never responded. Avery looked at Elizabeth carefully. He also says he subsequently learned from a mutual acquaintance that Carter had received the letter and chose not to act on it. "He knew," Elizabeth said quietly. "He knew from the beginning that Daniel Whitmore was willing to correct the record, and he suppressed it." "It appears so." The room was quiet for a moment. Nathaniel said, "That goes into the counterfiling." "It already has," Avery said. "I added it this morning." He opened his document case. "There's more. Your inquiry into the Virginia estate records." He looked at Elizabeth. "The men in Charlottesville found what they were looking for. Or rather, they found the absence of what should have been there." Elizabeth leaned forward. "Your father's estate," Avery said, "included at the time of his death a parcel of land 60 acres on the eastern edge of the original Carter property that was sold by William Carter as executor 14 months after your father died. The sale is documented in the county records. The proceeds of that sale, approximately $900, do not appear in the estate accounts that William provided to you. $900. Almost exactly the amount that had been listed in the accounting William gave her as a debt against her father's estate, a debt she had never been able to trace to a specific creditor. He sold the land, she said, and used the proceeds to zero out a debt he fabricated. That is what the documents suggest. Can you prove it? With the county sale record, your father's original land survey, and the estate accounting William provided to you, yes. The gap is not explainable by any legitimate means. Avery folded his hands. It is also in the Commonwealth of Virginia a criminal act, executor fraud. The word sat in the room. Nathaniel looked at her. She looked at the table. He won't come forward voluntarily, she said. The letter I sent him, he'll have seen it by now. He'll know what we found. Most likely, Avery agreed. Then what does he do? Nathaniel asked. A man in his position has limited options, Avery said. He can attempt to discredit the evidence, but the county records are not his to alter. He can attempt to discredit the people presenting it, which is what the letter to Mercer was. He paused. Or he can negotiate. Elizabeth thought about her uncle. She thought about his desk, his careful handwriting, his efficiency. She thought about a man who had spent 20 years building respectability in Albemarle County and who had one piece of leverage left. He'll use Mercer, she said. Whatever relationship he has with Mercer, it goes beyond the affidavit. If Mercer wins this land case, William gets something. Protection payment, a guarantee of silence from someone with enough resources to make the Virginia matter go away. She looked at Avery. What happens to the Nashville case if we present the Virginia evidence at the hearing? Avery looked at her steadily. The Virginia matter is not directly relevant to the property dispute. Dodd could rule it inadmissible. But it is relevant to the question of my character and credibility, she said. If my uncle is presenting himself to this court as a reliable witness to my unsuitability, and he turns out to be a man who committed executor fraud against his own brother's estate, then his credibility as a witness is considerably diminished, Avery said. Yes. Then we present it, Nathaniel said. They both looked at him. We present everything, he said. All of it. The survey, Whitmore's testimony, the Virginia estate records, all of it in one proceeding. He looked at Elizabeth. You said we couldn't let them define us before we could speak for ourselves. Then we speak first. We speak loudly. And we don't leave anything on the table. Elizabeth held his gaze. She thought about Mercer's smile in the east sitting room. She thought about her uncle's letter burning in the fireplace. She thought about 11 months of careful incremental moves, one door at a time, one document at a time, one piece of trust built at a time. She thought about Nathaniel's hand on hers in the front hallway. All right, she said. Then we speak first. The night before the hearing, she could not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed in the lodging house and listened to the sounds of Nashville, so different from the plantation's quiet, full of cartwheels and voices, and the general human noise of a city that did not stop. And she thought about everything that could go wrong tomorrow. Dodd could rule Whitmore's testimony inadmissible on procedural grounds. He could set aside the Briggs survey on a technicality. He could accept Mercer's framing and dismiss the Virginia material as irrelevant, and the hearing would be over in an hour, and they would have lost 300 acres of river bottom land to a fraud that had been built 20 years before either of them could have prevented it. Or Dodd could be the honest man Avery believed him to be, and the evidence would speak for itself, and it would be enough. She did not know which it would be. She was not by nature a person who comforted herself with optimism she could not justify. She believed in preparation and evidence and doing the work. She had done all of those things. The rest was not in her control. She was still awake when the knock came at her door. Soft, 3 times. Nathaniel's knock, she knew it now, the particular rhythm of it. She got up and opened the door. He was still dressed, which meant he hadn't slept either. He stood in the corridor with one hand braced on the doorframe and looked at her with the expression she had come to know, not the careful blankness, not the measured distance, but the open one. The one that was only for her. "Can't sleep," she said. "No." He agreed. "You should try." "I know." He didn't move. "I wanted to say something before tomorrow, in case—" He stopped. "In case it goes wrong and afterward isn't the right time." She waited. "You came to this house as a punishment," he said. "That's what they intended it to be. What your uncle intended, what the county intended, what I allowed by agreeing to the arrangement without—" His jaw worked briefly. "Without any thought for what it meant to you." He met her eyes. "I've been thinking about that a great deal lately, about what you deserve to have known from the beginning. And one of those things is this. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever Dodd decides or Mercer does or your uncle manages to arrange, you have nothing to answer for. Not to this court, not to Nashville, not to Charlottesville, not to anyone." He paused. "You are the most honest person I have ever known, and I am sorry it took me this long to say that plainly." She felt it move through her, not the careful incremental shift she had been managing for months, one door at a time, but something larger. Something that had been building since October, since November, since a cold night in a study and an untouched glass of whiskey, and she was done being careful about it. "Nathaniel," she said. "I'm not finished. I know." She reached out and took his hand the same way he had taken hers in the front hall weeks ago. His fingers closed around hers immediately. "But I need you to know that what you just said, I've been waiting to hear something like that for most of my life. Not from you specifically. From anyone." She held his gaze. "And you said it. And I won't forget it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her palm. This time, not her knuckles, a different gesture, more intimate, more deliberate. His eyes were closed briefly. "Get some sleep," he said very quietly. "You too," she said. He let go of her hand and stepped back. She closed the door. She stood against it in the dark for a moment with her palm still warm. Then she went back to bed and she slept. The hearing room in the Davidson County Courthouse was full. Elizabeth had not expected that. She had expected lawyers and a judge and the formal half-empty machinery of a property dispute. What she found was a room with 20-odd people in it, men who had interests in Mercer's consortium. Men who knew Nathaniel from the county's business community, a few women she did not recognize who might have been wives, or might have been simply curious, and the particular charged atmosphere of a proceeding that everyone present understood to matter beyond its immediate legal question. Mercer was there impeccably dressed with 2 lawyers beside him, and the expression of a man who has played this game before and expects to win it. He looked at Elizabeth when she entered, and his eyes did the same calculation they always did, assessing, weighing, deciding. She met his gaze and let him look. Judge Dodd was a large man with heavy eyebrows and the manner of someone who had been dealing with other people's disputes for a very long time and had arrived at a state of profound professional patience. He looked at the room over his glasses when he called the proceeding to order, and he looked like a man who intended to hear what was presented to him. Avery presented first. He was precise and methodical. The survey evidence, Briggs's testimony, the comparison of the 1799 and 1809 surveys, the documented discrepancy, and its likely explanation. He put the documents before Dodd one at a time in order like a man building something solid from the ground up. Mercer's lead attorney, a man named Galbraith, objected twice and was overruled both times. Then Avery called Daniel Whitmore. Whitmore was 40, a compact man with honest eyes who walked to the front of the room and stood as if he had made a decision about himself that morning and intended to keep it. He told his account in plain, direct language, the accident. Elizabeth's assistance, the doctor's arrival, his subsequent attempts to correct the rumors, his letter to William Carter. He did not elaborate beyond what he knew. He did not make himself the hero of the account. He simply told the truth, clearly, and without ornamentation, and sat down. Galbraith cross-examined him for 10 minutes and achieved nothing. Dodd looked at the documents Avery had presented. He looked at Whitmore. He looked at Mercer. And then Avery presented the Virginia estate records. Galbraith was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this evidence is entirely irrelevant to the property." "It is directly relevant," Avery said without raising his voice, "to the credibility of the affidavit filed by Mr. William Carter, which the plaintiff is relying upon to challenge the legal standing of Mrs. Elizabeth Hayes in these proceedings. If Mr. Carter's character as a witness is at issue, and the plaintiff has made it so by introducing his affidavit, then evidence bearing on that character is admissible." Dodd looked at Galbraith. Galbraith looked at Mercer. Something passed between them that Elizabeth could not read from across the room. "I'll allow it," Dodd said. "Continue." Avery laid out the Virginia material with the same deliberate precision. The land sale, the missing proceeds, the estate accounting provided to Elizabeth with a debt that could not be traced. The correspondence establishing that William Carter had received Whitmore's letter and chosen to suppress it. The room was very quiet. Galbraith objected twice more. Both times Dodd let Avery continue. And then Dodd said, "Is there a representative of Mr. Carter present?" There was not. Dodd looked at the room over his glasses. He looked at the documents on his bench. He looked at Mercer, whose expression had gone for the first time since Elizabeth had met him genuinely still. "Mr. Galbraith," Dodd said, "I'd like you to explain to me how a right-of-way agreement signed by a deceased man based on a survey that this court now has documented reason to question is meant to support a purchase option on 300 acres of a functioning estate." Galbraith began to speak. Dodd listened for approximately 90 seconds. Then he held up one hand. "I've heard enough," he said. The ruling took 20 minutes to write and 3 minutes to read aloud. The Fitch survey was set aside as demonstrably inconsistent with the historical record and unreliable as a legal reference. The Briggs survey was accepted as the authoritative documentation of the property's eastern boundary. The right-of-way agreement was declared unenforceable on the grounds that the claimed obstruction, the fence line, predated the agreement and could not reasonably have been created in violation of terms that did not yet exist. The purchase option was invalidated. Dodd read it all in the same professional, unhurried voice, and when he finished, he looked at Mercer over his glasses with the expression of a man who had formed a clear opinion and chosen not to voice it because the ruling said everything that needed saying. He closed the document. "This proceeding is concluded," he said. The room began to move, chairs scraping, voices rising, the particular collective exhale of people who have been holding their breath. Elizabeth sat very still for a moment. She heard Avery saying something beside her. She was aware of Nathaniel to her left. She did not look at Mercer. She did not need to. She felt Nathaniel's hand close over hers on the table. Not a public declaration, they were not people who made public declarations. Just his hand on hers, warm and certain and real. "It's done," he said quietly. "The land case is done," she said. He understood her immediately. "The Virginia matter will take longer." "Yes. Avery will handle it." "I know." She turned her hand over beneath his and held on. "I know he will." Across the room, Mercer was speaking to Galbraith in a low, tight voice. The expansive ease he had carried into every room she had ever seen him enter was gone. He looked for the first time like what he was, a man who had built a scheme on the assumption that no one would look closely enough to see it and had been wrong. He did not look at Elizabeth. She did not need him to. They were on the road back to Hayes Plantation by early afternoon. The carriage moved through the cold with the same driver and the same rutted roads, but everything else was different, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. "When Avery files in Virginia," Elizabeth said after a while, "William will fight it." "Probably," Nathaniel agreed. "He has resources. He has relationships in the county. He has 20 years of built reputation, and he'll spend all of it defending himself." She looked at the road ahead. "It will be long, and it will be unpleasant, and there's no guarantee of a complete outcome." "No," Nathaniel said. "There isn't." He paused. "Are you asking me whether it's worth pursuing?" "I'm asking whether you're prepared for what it costs." He looked at her. Are you? She considered that honestly. I've wanted this, the truth of it, the actual record corrected since I was 21 years old, and reading accounts I knew were wrong, and not being able to prove it. She met his eyes. Yes, I'm prepared for what it costs. Then we pursue it, he said. Simple. No qualification. She looked at him for a moment. You keep doing that, she said. Doing what? Deciding, she said. Quickly, without requiring me to justify myself further. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you've never needed to justify yourself to me. I was slow to say so. I'm trying to make up for lost time. He paused. I reckon I have some of that to make up. She looked at his hands. She looked at his face. She thought about 7 months from a courthouse in Charlottesville to a hearing room in Nashville, from a table set at opposite ends to a hand held in the cold. And she thought about how much had been built in that time quietly, without announcement, the way the best things are built. Nathaniel, she said. Ma'am? She almost laughed. She hadn't expected that the easy word, the small warmth of it. When we get home, she said, I'd like to move my things from the east corridor. He was very still. If that's... she began. Yes, he said. Immediate. No hesitation, no careful distance. Just one word plainly spoken with everything she needed to hear in it. She looked back at the road. She felt something open in her chest. Not the fragile, careful shift of the last 7 months, but something larger and permanent and real. The feeling of a woman who has spent a great deal of her life in transit from her father's house to her uncle's house to a courthouse to a carriage to a plantation she had not chosen and has arrived at last somewhere she has chosen for herself. Good, she said. Outside Tennessee moved past them cold and wide and indifferent, the way land is indifferent to the people who love it and fight for it and stay. Inside the carriage, Nathaniel Hayes reached across and took his wife's hand, and she let him, and they rode the rest of the way home without needing to say anything at all. They arrived home after dark. The plantation was quiet, in the way it always was at that hour. The hands gone to their quarters. Agnes's kitchen dark. The house holding its breath, the way houses do when they have been empty all day and are only just remembering how to be inhabited again. Mrs. Pruitt had left a lamp burning in the front hall and a cold supper on the dining room sideboard, which was exactly the kind of practical kindness Elizabeth had come to associate with the woman, never sentimental, always present. Nathaniel carried her traveling bag up the stairs himself. She did not remark on it. At the top of the stairs, he turned right instead of left, away from the east corridor, toward the master bedroom and the sitting room that connected to it, the rooms she had passed through 100 times on various errands, but never entered as anything other than a visitor. He opened the door and set her bag inside and stepped back into the corridor. He started. Stay, she said. Not a demand. Not even quite a request. Just a word offered plainly the way she offered everything now, without pretense, without calculation. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back inside and closed the door. They did not speak much that night. They did not need to. Some things are communicated better in silence, and they had always understood each other best in the space between words. But late, when the fire had burned low and the house was fully quiet around them, Nathaniel said into the dark, I used to think this house was a punishment. She was still. For what? For surviving, he said. For coming back when better men didn't. A pause. For a long time, being here felt like serving a sentence, going through the motions of a life I hadn't earned. She turned her head toward him. She could not see his face clearly in the low light, but she did not need to. And now? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different. Not the careful voice, not the measured voice, but the one underneath all of that. The one she had been listening for since November, in a cold study with an untouched glass of whiskey and 11 dead men on his conscience. Now it feels like mine, he said, for the first time. She reached out in the dark and found his hand. "It always was," she said. Spring came to Hayes Plantation in the particular way it comes to Tennessee, fast and loud and without apology. Green pushing up through everything that had been gray, the river running high with snowmelt. The Southfield's winter rye coming in exactly as Elizabeth had predicted it would. The cover crop was the first thing Tom Hicks mentioned when he came to the house that March morning, hat in hand, face open with a relief that had nothing to do with the rye and everything to do with knowing the land was safe. "She's coming in strong, ma'am," he said. "Just like you said." "I'm glad," Elizabeth said. "Tell the men I said so." Hicks turned his hat in his hands. He was not a man who said much beyond the practical, which was one of the things she had come to respect about him. But he stood a moment longer than necessary, and she understood that he was saying something without saying it. "Thank you, Tom," she said, "for your testimony in Nashville, for everything." He nodded once, short and certain, and put his hat back on and went. She stood at the kitchen doorway and watched him go, and thought about the particular loyalty that is not asked for and not performed, just given quietly, by people who have watched long enough to decide you're worth it. The letter from Avery came in April. It was longer than his usual correspondence, which told her before she opened it that the news was significant. She read it at the desk in the estate office, which was now by unspoken agreement, as much her desk as Nathaniel's, her ledger books along the left side, his survey documents along the right, the middle space shared, and companionably disordered. She read it twice. Then she set it down and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Nathaniel came in from the fields at mid-morning and found her there. He read her face before he read the letter. "Tell me," he said. "William has agreed to settle," she said. "He's acknowledging the discrepancy in the estate accounts. He'll return $900, the proceeds of the land sale, and he'll sign a corrected accounting." She paused. "He won't admit fraud." Avery says getting him to admit fraud in a formal proceeding would require a longer fight than the settlement offers, and that the practical outcome is essentially the same. Nathaniel sat down across from her. "And the public record. Avery is filing the corrected accounting with the Charlottesville County Court. It will be on record that the original accounting was," she chose the word carefully, "incomplete. And the rumor, the scandal. William won't issue a public statement. Avery says he won't. That's not part of the settlement." She met Nathaniel's eyes. "But Daniel Whitmore has agreed to speak openly about what he knows in Charlottesville to anyone who asks. And Porter and the other men Avery worked with, they're known in the county. What they know will travel." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that enough for you?" It was the right question. He always asked the right question. Now had learned over the last 4 months to ask what she actually needed, rather than what he assumed she needed, which was one of the ways she had come to love him with such inconvenient completeness. "No," she said honestly. "It's not everything I wanted. I wanted him to say it plainly in front of the people who heard the lie, that the lie was his." She paused. "But what I wanted and what is available are two different things, and I know how to work with what's available." She looked at the letter. "The land is safe. Your property is protected. The record in Virginia is corrected. And the people who matter in Charlottesville will know the truth, even if it isn't written in the form I would have chosen." She folded the letter. "That's not nothing." "No," Nathaniel said. "It isn't." He paused. "The $900. Yes? That's yours. Not the estate's not." "I know." She had thought about this already. "I want to put it toward the drainage work on the east field. We've been deferring it because of the legal costs." He looked at her. "It's more useful there than anywhere else I can think of," she said. Elizabeth." He said her name quietly, and she looked up, and he was watching her with the expression that she had finally, in the privacy of her own mind, learned to name without flinching. "It's your inheritance. It should go toward—" "It is going toward something mine," she said simply. "This land is mine, in every way that matters." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, it is." She did not expect the visit from Margaret Hale. Mrs. Hale was the wife of the county's largest cotton merchant, a woman who had lived in the region for 30 years and whose opinion in local society moved like weather. You could feel it coming before it arrived, and it shaped everything in its path. She appeared at Hayes' plantation on a Tuesday in May, with her daughter and a basket of preserves and the specific manner of a woman who has made a decision and intends to execute it with decorum. Elizabeth received her in the front parlor. "Mrs. Hayes," Margaret Hale said, settling herself with the practiced ease of a woman accustomed to drawing rooms. "I have been meaning to call for some time. I hope you'll forgive the delay." "Not at all," Elizabeth said. "I'm glad you've come." Mrs. Hale looked at her directly, assessing, but not unkindly. "I was in Nashville in February. I was present for a portion of the hearing." Elizabeth kept her face composed. "I see. I saw you," Mrs. Hale said, "in that courtroom." She paused. "I want you to know that what I saw, the evidence you and Mr. Hayes presented, the conduct throughout, was not what I had been led to expect." "What had you been led to expect?" Mrs. Hale had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "A woman of compromised judgment," she said plainly. "That is what was said of you when your husband first brought you here. I confess I did not go out of my way to form my own opinion." Elizabeth said nothing. She had learned that silence in moments like this was more useful than speech. "I am forming it now," Mrs. Hale continued. "That is why I'm here." She set the basket of preserves on the table between them, as if placing a flag in disputed territory. "I would like if you're willing to begin again." Elizabeth looked at the basket. She looked at Margaret Hale. This woman who had allowed a story to stand unchallenged, and who was now in her way, doing the thing William Carter had refused to do, acknowledging that the story had been wrong. It was not an apology. It was not a full accounting. It was a basket of preserves, and a direct look, and a woman who had decided she preferred truth to convenience. "I'm willing," Elizabeth said. "Would you like more coffee?" Margaret Hale smiled for the first time, and it transformed her. "I would," she said. "Very much." By summer, the visits had become a regular occurrence, not just Mrs. Hale, but 3 or 4 other women from the county's established families who came because Margaret Hale came, and because word had a way of traveling, and what it said now was different from what it had said a year ago. Nathaniel noticed. He said nothing about it for several weeks, and then one evening over dinner, he said, "Mrs. Hale asked me today how the Eastfield drainage was coming along." Elizabeth looked up. "What did you tell her?" "I told her my wife had designed the system, and she'd have to ask you." He paused. She seemed to find that amusing. "Did she?" She said, and I'm quoting, "Mr. Hayes, I believe your wife is considerably more formidable than this county gave her credit for." He looked at Elizabeth with the corner of his mouth lifting. "I told her I had always known it." Elizabeth set down her fork. "You did not always know it." "No," he agreed, "but I knew it before Margaret Hale did, and I intend to take credit for that." She looked at him across the dinner table. This table they had pulled close months ago so they didn't have to shout across the length of it, and she felt the particular happiness that is not dramatic, not the happiness of a resolved crisis or a vindicated argument, but the ordinary kind. The kind that comes from sitting across a table from a person you trust completely and finding them still genuinely worth looking at. "You're insufferable," she said. "Reckon so," he said, entirely unbothered. She picked up her fork and went back to dinner, and she was smiling, and she did not try to stop. The twist came in July, in the form of a letter that nobody had expected. It was addressed to Elizabeth in a handwriting she did not recognize, postmarked from Lexington, Kentucky. She opened it at the breakfast table. Alone, Nathaniel had gone out early to meet a contractor about the drainage work, and she read it standing up because she had picked it up on her way through the hall and had not bothered to sit. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the nearest chair and read it a third time. The letter was from a woman named Catherine Calloway, the wife of Sergeant James Calloway. The widow. She had heard about Nathaniel Hayes, she wrote, from men who had served under him. Men who had in recent months begun to speak more openly about the Chateauguay engagement and what had actually happened there. She had heard about the inquiry that Nathaniel had quietly commissioned 2 years prior, an attempt through a former officer he trusted to establish the factual record of what intelligence had been available and what decision had been made on the basis of it. She had heard that the inquiry had found what he already knew, that the intelligence was wrong, that the decision was made in good faith, and that the men who died were not sacrificed for advancement or recklessness, but lost in the particular terrible way that men are lost in war when imperfect information meets an imperfect world. She had heard all of this, she wrote, and she had spent 6 months deciding whether to write this letter. She had decided to write it because she had a daughter who was 12 years old and who asked sometimes about her father, and Catherine Calloway had spent 12 years not knowing what to tell her. She had spent 12 years angry in the vague way you are angry when there is no clear target. Angry at the war, angry at the army, angry at the shape of things. She was not angry now. Or rather she was, but it had found its proper form, and it was not aimed at Nathaniel Hayes. She wrote, "My husband believed in you. He told me so in his letters. He said you were the kind of officer who knew his men's names, and I know that sounds like a small thing, but it is not a small thing. It is the thing I have held on to for 12 years. He died following a man who knew his name. That is not nothing. I want you to know that I believe it is not nothing." She did not ask for anything. She did not offer forgiveness as a transaction. She simply told him what she knew and what she thought, and she signed it, respectfully, Catherine Calloway. Elizabeth set the letter on the table. She sat for a long time. She thought about a study in November, and a fire burned down to almost nothing, and a man who had been paying a debt he believed was infinite. She thought about the particular cruelty of guilt that has no end, guilt that does not diminish with time, because the person carrying it has decided somewhere beneath conscious reasoning that diminishing it would be a betrayal of the people it's owed to. She thought about what Catherine Calloway had just done. Without knowing it, without intending it as medicine, she had given Nathaniel Hayes the one thing no court ruling and no property victory and no act of Elizabeth's love could have given him. Permission, not to forget, not to be absolved, but to carry it differently, to understand from the mouth of the woman who had the most right to condemn him that what he had done was not what he had believed it to be. Elizabeth heard the front door. She heard his boots in the hall. She heard him say something to Mrs. Pruitt, and she heard him coming toward the dining room. She picked up the letter and held it in both hands. He came in and saw her face. "What's happened?" he said immediately. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He had learned in the last several months to trust her tone, to hear in it the difference between crisis and significance, and to respond accordingly. He sat and he looked at her, and he waited. She held the letter out to him. He took it. He read it. She watched his face. He read it the way she had twice and then a third time. And she watched the expression on his face do something she had never seen it do before, not in a year of living alongside him, not in the best moments or the hardest ones. It broke. Quietly, without drama, the way ice breaks in early spring, not a catastrophe, but a release, the sound of something that has been held rigid too long, finally letting go. He set the letter on the table, with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything. He looked at his hands. He pressed them flat on the table surface, and she saw them tremble once briefly and then stop. She did not say anything. She did not reach for him immediately. She gave him the moment, gave him the privacy of it, because he was a man who had spent 3 years not having a single private moment of grief, and he deserved to have this one without an audience, even her. But then she reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. He turned one hand over and held on. They sat like that for a long time. Finally, he said very quietly, "She doesn't blame me." "No," Elizabeth said. "She doesn't. She had every right to." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "She did, and she chose not to. That's what makes it mean something." She paused. "She told you the truth, Nathaniel, not what would comfort you, the truth. And the truth is that her husband died following a man who knew his name and she has held that for 12 years, and she wanted you to know it still means something to her." He was quiet for a long time. His hands were still under hers, warm and steady now. "I want to write to her," he said. "I know you do. I don't know what to say." "Tell her the truth," Elizabeth said. "The same thing she told you. You don't need to explain yourself or defend yourself or ask for anything. Just tell her what you know about James Calloway. Tell her what you remember." He looked up at her. "I remember everything," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why you should be the one to tell her." He wrote the letter that evening. Elizabeth did not ask to read it. He did not offer to show it. Some things are private even between two people who have stopped keeping secrets, and she understood that this was one of them. He sealed it and set it on the front table for the Morning Post, and then he came to find her where she was working in the office, and he stood in the doorway, in the way he had always stood in doorways, but differently now, she thought. Not checking his escape, just pausing the way a person pauses when they want to be present for a moment before they move through it. "Thank you," he said. She looked up from her ledger. "I didn't do anything." "You let me read it alone." She understood what he meant. "Of course." He came in and sat across from her. He did not pick up a book or a document. He just sat in the comfortable way they had both learned to just sit in each other's presence. And after a while he said, "I want to do something for her. Mrs. Calloway. Not—" He paused. "Not as a payment, not as if it could be a payment, but I want to do something." "What are you thinking?" "She has a daughter, 12 years old, a girl growing up without her father's name carrying any weight, without any of the things that come from having a father who served and was respected." He looked at the desk. "I have connections in the Tennessee militia records, former officers I served with, men who are still willing to speak plainly about what happened at Chateauguay if asked." He paused. "I want to see if there's a way to have James Calloway's record formally corrected, not expunged, corrected. To have the official account reflect what actually happened, rather than the version that allowed certain men to avoid accountability." Elizabeth set down her pen. She looked at him steadily. "That's a significant undertaking," she said. "I know. It will require navigating military bureaucracy and political relationships, and probably quite a lot of paperwork." "I know." A pause. "I know someone who's good at paperwork." She looked at him for a moment. Then, "Write to your former officers first. Find out who's willing to speak officially. We need to know what we're working with before we decide how to proceed." "We," he said. "Did you think I'd let you do it alone?" He looked at her with that expression, the open one, the one with nothing behind it but exactly what it was. "No," he said. "I didn't think that." Summer moved through its long days and warm nights, and Hayes Plantation moved with it. The Eastfield drainage completed in June, the cover crop turned under in July, to enrich the soil before fall. Planting, the household settled into rhythms that felt to everyone in it like something permanent. Agnes started saving recipes. Not for any particular reason she would have named aloud, but the kind of saving that happens when a person begins to believe that what they're living in is going to last. Mrs. Pruitt stopped carrying her keys, as if they might be taken from her at any moment. Tom Hicks built a new fence section on the eastern boundary, not because it needed it, but because, as he told Nathaniel straightforwardly, wanted to put a proper post where Briggs drove his stake. Seems right. Nathaniel had looked at Elizabeth when Hicks said that, and she had looked at him, and neither of them had said anything, because nothing needed saying. 9. It was a September evening 1 year and 2 weeks from the day Elizabeth had arrived at Hayes Plantation, with one traveling bag and a book on soil management, when Nathaniel found her in the kitchen garden at dusk. She was harvesting the last of the late tomatoes, moving down the row, with the particular efficiency of a woman who has done this enough times to stop thinking about the mechanics and simply inhabit the work. She heard him come up behind her, and did not turn immediately, because she had learned that with Nathaniel, as with most things that mattered, there was no rush. He stood beside her. He picked up the nearest tomato from the vine and turned it in his hands. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "You've had your thinking face on since breakfast." He looked at her sideways. "I have a thinking face. You have about 11 distinct expressions. I've cataloged them all." She kept working down the row. "The thinking face involves your left hand going still and your jaw doing a particular thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is unsettling." "You should try being married to someone who reads ledgers for fun," she said. "Everything becomes data." He almost laughed. She felt it more than heard it, the exhale, the loosening. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told her. "About the land being yours, in every way that matters. I remember saying it. I want to make it true in the ways that are still remaining." He set the tomato in her basket. "Legally, formally, Avery has been, I asked him in the spring to look at how the estate is structured, the property, the accounts, how they're held and in whose name and what that means if—" He stopped. She turned to look at him. "If something happened to me," he said plainly, "I want you to be protected. Not just provided for, protected. With authority, with standing, with your name on the documents that matter." He met her eyes. "You've run this estate for a year. You've saved it twice. You know it better than anyone alive, including me. The law as it stands doesn't reflect that, and I want to remedy it to the extent that I can." She looked at him for a long moment. "Avery has a proposal," she said. It was not a question. "He does. And you've already reviewed it." "I have." "And you came out here to tell me, rather than leaving it on my desk or mentioning it at dinner, because this isn't a business matter," he said. "It's what I owe you, and I wanted to say it plainly, not through a document." She was quiet for a moment. The kitchen garden was warm and late in the day, the light going gold, the tomatoes heavy on the vine. "All right," she said. "All right, you'll review Avery's proposal, or—" "All right to all of it," she said. "I trust your judgment and I trust Avery, and I trust that what you've arranged is correct." She turned back to the tomatoes. "I don't need to see it before I agree to it." He was still for a moment. "You trust me?" he said. Not surprised exactly, something more careful than surprised. "Implicitly," she said. "Have done for some time." Another silence. She heard him move, felt him step closer. He reached past her and picked a tomato from the vine she was working. The last one, the one she'd been about to take, and he turned her hand over gently and placed it in her palm. She looked down at his hand over hers. She looked up at him. "I love you," he said. Quiet, certain, as plain as everything that mattered to him. She felt it land not as a surprise, because nothing between them had been a surprise in quite some time, but as a completion. As the thing that had been building since October and November and December, and the long winter, and the hearing in Nashville, and the letter from Kentucky, and all the evenings, and all the silences finally spoken aloud in the September kitchen garden, with a tomato in her hand. "I know," she said. "I love you too." He pressed his lips to her temple. Not a dramatic gesture, not a performance, just a point of contact between two people who have found each other through a great deal of difficulty and have decided clearly and without reservation to stay. "Come inside," he said. "Agnes is keeping supper." "In a minute," she said. "I want to finish the row." He picked up the basket and held it while she worked, and they did not speak again until the row was done. Years later, when the daughter they had not yet imagined asked her father how he had come to love her mother, Nathaniel Hayes sat for a moment in the way he still sat when he was deciding how to say something true. "She was sent to me," he said, "by people who thought a hard life would break her." "And did it?" his daughter asked. "No," he said. "She broke the hard life instead." He paused. "And she was kind enough to show me how it was done." His daughter looked at her mother, who was sitting across the room with a ledger and a cup of coffee, and the expression of a woman who had heard this story before, and still did not mind hearing it again. "Is that true?" she asked. Elizabeth looked up. She looked at Nathaniel, this man she had married as a punishment in a plain white dress with no flowers and no celebration, and had chosen every day for every year since to stay beside. "More or less," she said, "though I'd say we showed each other." Nathaniel smiled. The full one, not the shadow, the real thing which had turned out to be, once Elizabeth had coaxed it into regular existence, entirely worth the wait. "More or less," he agreed. Outside, the Tennessee summer moved through its long golden afternoon, indifferent as always to the particular happiness of the people living inside it. The south field was green and producing. The eastern boundary held its proper line. The house was full of the ordinary sounds of a life being well lived, and Elizabeth Carter Hayes, who had arrived at this place with one bag and a book and a promise to herself that she would not disappear, sat in the afternoon light and drank her coffee, and knew with a certainty she no longer needed to examine or defend or prove to anyone that she had kept that promise. She had not disappeared. She had, against every odd that had been arranged against her, become exactly who she was, and that every bit of it was entirely her own.